The report reached George Patton on a freezing afternoon in Lorraine with one question inside it. Were the red crosses visible, not hidden, not blurred by smoke, not confused with a supply truck or a command post? Visible. A marked medical place had been hit. A protected American medical officer was dead, and the German officer connected to the order had not stumbled into a mistake of battle. He had crossed a line that armies had written down long before this war began. Patton did not explode. That is the part people get wrong about him. The famous Patton was all thunder. The polished helmet, the pistols, the barking speeches, the theatrical rage he used like a weapon. But when the report on the Red Cross killing came across his desk, the anger went cold. He wanted names. He wanted witness statements. He wanted unit markings. He wanted the chain of custody on the papers, because a dead nurse could not speak at a tribunal. The file would have to speak for her. By November 1944, the Third Army had been fighting so long that time had turned into mud. The breakout from Normandy had become a race across France, and then the race had run into the hard wall of fuel, weather, rivers, and German resistance. Patton's army, built for motion, found itself grinding through villages and ridgelines in Lorraine as if Europe had dragged them backward into the First World War. Fields that looked empty in the morning were under shell fire by noon. Roads that could carry tanks in August became troughs of frozen mud by night. Men who had been told they were chasing a beaten enemy were now dying for stone barns, rail crossings, and tree lines with names nobody at home would ever learn. The medical units lived inside that misery, aid stations close to the front, collecting companies farther back, clearing stations behind them, field hospitals where the wounded arrived in waves, too large for the tents, too fast for the surgeons, and too broken for anyone to pretend war still had clean edges. The Red Cross appeared on canvas, on ambulances, on helmets, on armbands. It was not decoration. It was not a plea. It was treaty language made visible. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, medical personnel were protected. The point was simple enough for any trained officer to understand. The men and women treating the wounded were not to be made targets. Germany had signed that rule. Its officers knew it. So when a German officer gave an order against a marked medical unit, the question was not whether he understood the sign. The question was whether he believed the sign still mattered. That was the question Patton fixed on, not because he was soft. No one who served under him would have used that word. Patton believed speed could break an army. He believed hesitation killed men. He believed a commander had to impose will on chaos before chaos imposed itself on the commander. But he also believed something harsher than mercy: discipline. An army that stopped obeying the laws of war did not become stronger in his mind. It became loose. It became contaminated. It became a mob wearing uniforms. And mobs could not be trusted with victory. So when the first accounts came in, Patton's staff did not receive a speech about vengeance. They received an instruction that mattered more. Make the record complete. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Complete. The witnesses had to be found before their units moved again. The location had to be fixed, while shell craters and tire tracks could still be mapped. The markings had to be described clearly enough that no defense could later call them doubtful. The officer's rank, unit, position, and authority had to be traced, because a war crime is not punished by fury. It is punished by evidence. The woman at the center of the file was an Army nurse. That detail matters. By 1944, American military nurses were not volunteers hovering at the edge of the Army. They were commissioned officers. They worked under military discipline in military hospitals, inside the machinery of a war that badly needed them and rarely gave them the language they deserved. They handled shock before it had a name. They held pressure on wounds while artillery shook the canvas. They counted morphine syrettes in the dark. They learned which silence meant sleep and which silence meant a patient was slipping away. Their courage was not the kind the war posters loved. It did not charge across open ground. It stayed beside a stretcher. The record does not preserve every human detail of this woman with the care it should have. That is one of the quiet cruelties of military paperwork. The guilty officer gets a rank. The chain of command gets a diagram. The procedure gets a number. The victim sometimes becomes a line in a case file, but the line is enough to tell us what the law already knew. She was in a protected role. She was in a marked medical area. She was not carrying out an attack. She was owed protection. And she died because someone with authority decided that protection could be ignored. When the German officer was later taken into American custody, he came in as thousands of prisoners did that winter, cold, hungry, exhausted, his uniform worn down by retreat, his face carrying the gray emptiness of a man who had spent weeks losing ground and pretending that losing ground was still strategy. At first, he was just another officer in the prisoner flow. Name, rank, unit, command assignment, possible intelligence value. That was how prisoner processing worked. Methodical, boring, necessary. Then his information met the file, a name already written down, a unit already described, a witness chain already waiting. He was separated from the general prisoner population. And this is where the story becomes more revealing than a simple punishment scene ever could. Patton did not order him beaten. He did not order a roadside execution. He did not allow his men to treat the man the way the man had treated the Red Cross. That restraint was not softness. It was the point. If the United States was going to accuse an enemy officer of violating the laws of war, then the United States had to keep those laws intact while holding him. Otherwise, the accusation lost its spine. The confrontation, as remembered in the accounts around Patton's headquarters, was brief. No courtroom, no grand stage, no shouted sermon for the cameras. A German officer stood before the commander of the army that had captured him, and Patton made the distinction plain. A prisoner of war is protected because he has been taken out of the fight. A war criminal is held because he has stepped outside the law of war. Those two things are not the same. That was the line Patton wanted understood. The man could be guarded under the convention and still answer for violating it. He could receive process and still face judgment. He could be alive, fed, recorded, and protected from revenge, while the case against him moved forward. That is a harder idea than revenge. Revenge is simple. Accountability requires machinery, and in the winter of 1944, that machinery was still being built while the war was still killing people. The Allied legal system for war crimes was not yet the familiar thing people talk about now. Nuremberg had not opened. The final German surrender was still months away. Lawyers, soldiers, diplomats, and judges were still arguing over how individual officers should be held responsible for crimes committed under orders, inside campaigns, under the cover of war. But on the ground, the principle was already being forced into shape by cases like this. A marked aid station, a dead medical officer, a captured German officer, a file that refused to disappear into the fog of battle. The battlefield was producing the evidence before the tribunals had finished building the rooms, and Patton understood something many commanders only understand too late. If you wait until the war is over to start collecting the truth has already begun to rot. Witnesses scatter, maps vanish, vehicles are repaired, tents are burned or moved, bodies are buried. Memories defend themselves by blurring, so the order had to come early. Write it down now. Find the witnesses now. Fix the details now. because later every guilty man would learn the same defense. Confusion, chaos, no clear markings, no direct order, no memory, no proof. The only answer to that defense was a record built before the excuses arrived. Then December came. The German army struck through the Ardennes, and the Western Front cracked open into what would become the Battle of the Bulge. In that frozen emergency, the laws of war were tested again in ways that could have poisoned both sides. At Malmedy, Waffen-SS troops murdered American prisoners in a field after they had surrendered. News of the massacre traveled fast. So did the anger. Every commander in the American line understood the danger. Men who heard what had happened to other prisoners might stop taking prisoners themselves. They might decide the enemy had chosen the rules for everyone. That is how atrocities multiply. One crime becomes permission for the next. Patton's answer was not to pretend the rage was not there. His answer was to contain it with orders. German prisoners were still to be taken. The Geneva rules still applied. American discipline was not to be surrendered because German units had abandoned theirs. At the same time, the files on German violations kept moving. That dual track is the heart of this story. Hold your own men to the law. Hold the enemy's criminals to account. Not one or the other, both. When Patton turned elements of his army north to relieve Bastogne, the legend of that movement nearly swallowed everything else around it. Maps, road marches, snow, armor moving through frozen France and Belgium with a speed that still gives military historians something to study. But while the Third Army was fighting its most famous operational battle, the quieter work continued behind it. Prisoners were screened, reports were typed, witnesses were located. Judge-advocate officers compiled case files for crimes that would never fit neatly inside the myth of battlefield glory. The myth wants war to be decided only by tanks and generals. The record says something colder. War is also decided by what an army chooses to remember. By April 1945, Patton's army was inside Germany. Then came Ohrdruf. American troops uncovered the camp in early April, a subcamp connected to Buchenwald, and what they found there stripped away the last safe abstractions. Bodies lay where the SS had left them. Survivors carried the physical evidence of starvation, forced labor, and calculated murder. Patton saw it. The man who had spent his life imagining war as movement, steel, courage, and will was confronted with something different. A system where murder had been made administrative. He was shaken badly. And then the same instinct returned. Make people see it. Make the record undeniable. Make denial harder than memory. German civilians from the nearby area were compelled to confront what had happened near them. Senior commanders were urged to witness the camps. Photographs were taken. Statements were collected. Not because documentation could redeem what had happened. It could not. But because without documentation, crime becomes rumor. And rumor is exactly where the guilty want history to live. The Red Cross file belonged on that same moral road, even if it was smaller in scale. A nurse killed under a protected sign is not the same as a camp system built for mass death, but both depend on the same collapse. First, the rule becomes inconvenient. Then the protected person becomes an obstacle. Then the killing is treated as procedure. Then someone says there was no choice. Patton had little patience for that last sentence. There is always a choice at the moment an officer gives an order. That is why officers exist. After Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the files became heavier than paper. They became evidence. The great public trial at Nuremberg would put the highest Nazi leaders before the world. But many smaller proceedings handled the crimes committed by officers, guards, and officials whose names had never commanded nations, but whose decisions had destroyed human beings within arm's reach. The American-run proceedings at Dachau tried hundreds of accused war criminals between 1945 and 1947. Those cases did not all move cleanly. Some procedures were later criticized. Some records are difficult to trace. Some sentences were changed. Some outcomes remain buried in archives that do not give storytellers the neat endings they want. But the principle held. A uniform was not a license. A command was not a shield. A battlefield was not a place where the law disappeared. The officer connected to the Red Cross killing did not remain merely another captured man among thousands. He became part of a legal question the world had to answer. What does civilization do with a soldier who uses war itself as an excuse to murder the protected? Patton did not live long enough to watch the entire post-war legal structure take shape. In December 1945, he died after a car accident in Germany. He was buried in Luxembourg among the soldiers of the army he had led. History has remembered him unevenly, and it should. The slapping incidents were real. The vanity was real. The reckless statements were real. The hard brilliance was real. The command instinct was real. And so was this. In a frozen headquarters, during a campaign that had exhausted everyone around him, a report crossed his desk about a Red Cross killing. He did not let it become battlefield noise. He did not let the victim vanish into the weather. He did not confuse punishment with documentation. He understood that the law needed a file before it could become justice. That is why the question at the beginning matters. Were the Red Crosses visible? Because if they were visible, then the case was not about confusion. It was about choice. A German officer made one. Patton made another. One treated the Red Cross as a target. The other treated the record as a weapon. The nurse could not testify. So the file did. And in the end, that is what the rules of war depend on. Not speeches, not myths, not the clean version of commanders that countries prefer to remember. They depend on someone in the middle of mud and fear and exhaustion saying, write it down, every detail, until the dead can no longer be erased.